Hi there and welcome. It's Kat. I'm riding solo tonight, so there's an actual introduction instead of just usually it just starting in the middle of a conversation. I'm back and I have a couple of episodes coming up here pretty soon that I'm excited about. So tonight we're going to just talk about a kind of obscure random resource that I found that's been extremely helpful. And even though it's sort of tangentially related to my family, it's been just a total goldmine for information and context. Going back, so this is, when you research, sometimes you're looking for the key people in your immediate family, but really sometimes the gems are actually like a few generations out or a distant cousin or whatever. So this person that I focus on in my family, so a main figure in my ancestry is my great-grandfather. And he was the son of Antonio Maria Pacheco, who I've talked about many times before, who was a New Mexico territorial representative several times over. The first he wasn't elected. The first appointed sheriff of Rio Arriba County after the U.S. took over. He also was married 3 times and had, I think, 19 children. And our line from Juan Andres is from the 3rd wife. And I've spoken a little bit about her before. She was the one who was addressed in the episode about the lost great-great-grandmother when we finally found her in the records. Because Juan Andreas was kind of at the end of this line, as is the case with many families, my own included, there's some weird age differentials. So this happens in my family as well. I'm the youngest of 6, and we're all very different. Our ages span many, many decades. And so I have a niece and a nephew who are older than I am. So the same happened with Juan Andreas and his family. So he actually was about the same age as his nephew. Yes, his nephew. So his sister was his half-sister, technically, was from one of those previous wives that Antonio Maria Pacheco had. So she was obviously a grown woman by the time that he was born and had a son of her own. And so technically the relationship with her son, Juan C. Martinez, was a nephew-uncle situation. Juan Andres was technically his uncle, but they were the same age. And so they were very close, more like best friends. So I had kind of run into this relationship because I kept kind of seeing them together. They both ended up going from Mora County to around the Folsom area and then to the Clayton area. And just sort of like they followed each other. I believe, genealogy can be full of wild speculation. My wild speculation is that after his parents were both killed, Juan Andreas was 16. And at 16, he probably, he was an orphan technically, but he also was maybe at the point where he could, kind of do his own thing. So at that point, I believe that he went to outside of Folsom where his half-sister and her family had settled in the Des Moines area. I think I'm saying that correctly. In Union County, where his best friend, they were about the same age. And then it's really cute because they were sort of single guys, hot around town. So when you read the newspapers from the Folsom area or Union County around that time, there's lots of mentions of them in the personal sections. It's about like just that they were very popular with the ladies, that they were just like really eligible bachelors around town. And there's an interesting again, wild speculation, but I'm putting some pieces together there that in the Folsom newspapers, it said that Juan C. Martinez had a party at his house in Folsom. And, that people were coming from all around the area. And then 6 months later, there's a mention of, in the personal section of the Folsom newspaper, I believe it's the Folsom Metropolitan, not sure, that Juan Andreas was rumored about to get engaged. And so that would be to my great-grandmother, who lived into the Colorado border in Las Animas County at Trinchera, old Trinchera. Not the Trinchera that's like farther west. This is like farther east. So there's Trinchera Pass that's kind of like a bit north of Folsom or close to Folsom. That Trinchera. It's along like Highway 160 when you like going east out of Trinidad. So, and I do know from those newspapers that there was a lot of interaction. I mean, to me, I'm like, that seems really far away. And you did have, in that area, you did have two passes. You had Trinchera Pass and you had Tollgate Canyon. And so it wouldn't have been that hard. It just would have been kind of a distance, but I think they were just used to traveling pretty far distances back then. And there were, there'd be items in the newspaper about horse races that were taking place in Folsom, and the people from Trinchera came to the horse races, or, there'd be, apparently Raton had really cool horse races. So, they would go from Folsom to Raton for the horse races or whatever. So I think they were just used to, like, if there was going to be a party, it would be worth, coming through Tollgate Canyon or Trinchera Pass or whatever to come. So my theory has always been that my great-grandmother, Iñacita Sanchez, came from Trinchera with her friends or her family or whoever to this party being held at Juan C. Martinez's. And that's where my great-grandparents met. So there's all these connections. Juan C. Martinez ended up marrying the daughter of Casimiro Barela. Casimiro Barela was a very, very well-known man in southern Colorado. He lived he lived outside of Trinidad. He is the longest running state senator in Colorado. I believe there's a stained glass window of him in the state capitol in Colorado. He was known as the perpetual senator because I think he was a senator for 45 years. And he was a businessman. He ran 2 Spanish language newspapers out of Trinidad, which I would absolutely die to see copies of. But as far as I know, no copies still exist. Also fascinates me that there were 2 Spanish language newspapers in Trinidad at that time. He also helped get the Colorado State Constitution translated into German and Spanish, so that those populations that spoke those languages in Colorado would know what their own state constitution would say. So, very important man. His daughter was named Juanita, and so yes, Juanita married Juan C. Martinez. They were both extremely educated. Juanita went to the convent school in Trinidad. And I probably know where. Let me see, I have this thing here. Okay, so it doesn't say where he went to school. It says that he attended public schools, was a pupil under Professor Eduardo de Hilder of Mora County. And after leaving home, he spent a year in Colorado in the service of the state government, assisting and translating the state laws. So he and Juanita were the ones that actually did the translation of the state constitution into Spanish. He also was the enumerator for the census for that area in 1890, I think. Not that that exists anymore. Maybe 1900 as well. Anyways, these were very educated people. Juan and Juanita were the testigos for the marriage of my great-grandparents. And then they were always mentioned together, when they, on the Clayton newspapers or Union County newspapers, as being together, doing business. And just like the families clearly stayed in contact. We're very close. And so I always include Juan C. Martinez in any of my searches. Although, to be honest, I'll start with this one resource that I found that actually I wasn't doing a search for Juan C. Martinez. I actually did a search, I believe, in the state archives or the state library for Antonio Maria Pacheco, who is my great-great-grandfather. But his name popped up in this entry that was actually for Juan C. Martinez in a book called The History of New Mexico. And of course I didn't write down I didn't write down the author. Okay, I did not write down the author of this book. So that's just serve as a cautionary tale for all of you. It was a pretty old book. I want to say it was from the 1920s. No, I think it's actually older than that. Oh God, I'm really sorry. I'm going to get in serious trouble from this. From all of the serious genealogists. Anyways, it was available. They had a whole section on different New Mexicans. I don't know how they determined who went into this book, but he was in there. And it was really, really great information. Some things I found in there that I didn't know that were applicable. It talked about how his grandfather was born at Taos and was in the freighting industry during the early 1840s and 50s on the Santa Fe Trail. So that kind of illustrates to me, when you have several of my family lines went pretty far afield, and you have to think that they had visited those places on set of maybe like freighting trips, and had actually like scouted out those locations to see that they were a great place to settle. So that kind of confirmed that for me. And then it does mention my great-great-grandfather of a prominent family of northern New Mexico, a representative from Rio Arriba County and one of the territorial councils. He actually was a representative from Mora County as well. And then it gives some information about like his family and their kids. So Juan and Juanita at first were not able to have children. So I believe, so they decided to adopt. Now there was a tradition in the Barela family of adoption. Casimiro Barela and his wife, or one or more of his wives, also adopted a lot of children, or just took in. I don't think these were like official adoptions. I think they just took in children that were orphaned or needed care. So Juan and Juanita eventually did have a son biologically, but they previously adopted several children. One of which is Eva Bent, who was the great-granddaughter of Governor Charles Bent. I'm going to cover that in more detail in a future episode. So today we're just going to focus on Dolores. Dolores was brought out to New Mexico on the orphan train from New York. She was integrated as a daughter, and in fact there's a photo in a biography of Casimiro Barela. There's a family portrait of Juan and Juanita, and it includes a picture of Dolores, and she looks absolutely freaking adorable. And so she was their daughter, and although I think she was we'll get into it. So I'd heard this story. I also knew that she was really close with the family, even later on. I actually interviewed my dad's first cousin, whose name was Eva. And she was like in her 90s. And as I was, asking her different questions, it turns out her name was Eva Dolores. Or no, her name is Dolores Eva. And those were the names of these two sisters from the Martinez family. So it just, again, was one of those things where these families were extremely close. So I knew that Dolores had married Jake Lujan, who became a politician and was the New Mexico State Comptroller, I believe, for many years. So he was very well known, and he was like a politico, and they often were in Santa Fe for different things. So, but generally they lived in Des Moines in Union County, and I believe that Dolores was the postmaster for like 45 years or something like that. So a lot of people knew her, but a lot of people didn't know her history. So I don't remember, this was many years ago. I was just doing some Googling, and I actually don't know what I was Googling. I don't remember what search term made it pop up, but somehow I found a record of, or a mention of, an oral history that Dolores's son had done with the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in Las Cruces. In the initial mention that I found, it did give a synopsis, and it was pretty lengthy. It was a couple of pages. So there were some substantial tidbits there, but it actually, I remember it said at the end or somewhere that this, what, like a full transcript was available at the museum. So I just made a mental note that next time I was in Las Cruces, I would stop by the museum and see if I could get the full transcript. Well, that was probably 10 years ago, and I finally made it back to Las Cruces and decided, I think that was in last February, decided to go by there and just see. Well, it turns out that Dolores' son was actually a docent. He had settled in Las Cruces. I think he went to the university there and ended up settling there, and was a docent after he retired at the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum. And so he was, I think, maybe the first or one of the first people that they interviewed, because he grew up on a ranch in Union County. And so it was sort of a test run maybe for this oral histories that they were trying to gather. I don't know how long they continue that program, but there are many of them available. And so if you go to the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum website, I believe they have those histories listed, and maybe some of them even have some parts of them transcribed for you to read right there. But I would encourage you to actually go and get the full transcript, because they're very long and very detailed and extremely interesting. So I finally just got to read through this whole thing, and it provided so much fascinating information, and I'm so glad that I did it, even though technically the person who gave the oral history was not actually really related, and very distantly related, but it gave me so much information that I really, really just ate up, really appreciated. So I'm going to go through just some of the highlights that I found from this interview. And again, like I said, it's very long. Let's see, I got 112 pages is the full thing. It also included a family tree that I'm assuming that he wrote out for them to go along with the oral history. And then it gives an abstract. So it kind of gives you just the topics that were covered. So so in the abstract it says family genealogy. His mother was adopted by Juan and Juanita Martinez. A little bit about the grandfather, what they did in Des Moines. Oh, county assessor for Union County, and then comptroller for the state of New Mexico. And then they talked about the ranch. He talks about the Depression, the war, but then he also talks about his mother being brought out on the orphan train and being adopted by this family. So that's kind of what got me to Las Cruces 10 years later to try to get the full account. So I looked at a little bit of research about the orphan train in New Mexico. we're living in very strange times. So, you know how now Google will give you the AI overview, which I tried to just scroll past immediately. But before I scrolled past it, I saw that it said that in 1904, trains to Des Moines, Clayton, and San Juan came from the New York Foundling Hospital. That was like, I just saw that glimpse of that and thought that I was going to find, the actual articles or information to give that. I never did. I couldn't find it. And then when I actually did the same search term, probably minutes later, the AI overview was different and did not give that information. So, as with anything with AI, just don't totally believe it. It's not always accurate. It gives a lot of inaccurate information. Also, it uses a lot of water and energy, and just don't use it for anything. However, that was like, okay, so where did they get that information? Is that true? And that is interesting because it just said that the year would have been correct. 1904 would have been probably the right time for her to come out from New York. They were Catholic, and the New York Foundling Hospital was Catholic. So those would have been Catholic kids coming out. And then it did mention only 3 towns that the train went to, one of which was Des Moines, which is where they lived. So take that with a grain of salt. And then I tried to contact the Orphan Train Museum, and I did do a search or an inquiry with them to see if there were any records about her specifically. They did not turn up anything, but that's not uncommon. There aren't a ton of records. So how the orphan train worked is that they would have an agent from there's different hospitals and organizations that would do this, did the orphan trains. They would send out an agent ahead of time to stir interest and work with a local committee to recruit and vet families. And they did advertise specifics sometimes. So like 3-year-old girl, French, brown hair. Supposedly Dolores was French. She was like 3 or 4. Around half of these children actually still had 1 to 2 living parents back in New York. So it wasn't necessarily, the term orphan train was a bit of a misnomer, and I think I read that they didn't actually call it that at the time, because a lot of especially in New York, the parents just couldn't afford to keep them, especially like if there was an illness and one of the parents died. To be a single parent was pretty much impossible at that time. I mean, think about the just lack of childcare. A lot of them are immigrants, so they didn't have family support or support systems for childcare. So they really just couldn't support these children. So this was supposed to be a better life. It was also, the West was newly settled, and so sadly, you needed children to help run your farm and help everybody survive. So it was supposed to be sort of like a win-win for everybody, that you had all of these children running loose, not being cared for on the streets of New York. And then you had all of these farms and communities out in the West that needed children or labor. I mean, I think the experience of children varied who went out on these. Some of them were adopted in as children and loved as part of the family. Others were really treated poorly or used basically as servant labor, free labor. So it seems that Dolores was, in fact, welcomed as a daughter. She's described as a daughter, as anything that I can find about them. They remained close, for their whole life as her parents. So he's describing quite a bit of this information about like background information for her, that her parents died and then she was adopted when she was 3. And then she was adopted by a Hispanic family from Des Moines, New Mexico. And it's interesting to think too that I don't know what her native language would have been, if it was in fact French or if she spoke English, I don't know. But then she's being adopted and raised at 3 years old by a Hispano family. I will say that Juan and Juanita were extremely well educated, and I believe they both maybe spoke Spanish in the home, but they were very fluent in English as well. I did find a possible, who could be possibly a mother for Dolores still in New York City in the census records. She was like living alone. She was about the right age. So it is possible that she actually did have a mother still in New York who just wasn't able to care for her. But that's just very wild speculation. I really cannot say for sure. Bill is the respondent, the one who's doing the oral history. He says that my grandmother adopted my mother, and then her sister adopted a boy, and that they just put them on the train and the conductor took care of them all the way from New York out to New Mexico. I'm not actually sure. I didn't think that was possible, but then I did confirm that sometimes they did, send that agent out ahead of time to do some recruiting and vet the families, and that they did advertise specifics. So it is possible that they weren't just like the typical orphan train story where, the train just kept going from city to city or town to town, and the kids would get off. Some were selected by families, some were not. Those that were not had to get back on the train and go to the next town and hope for the best. I guess it is possible that Dolores and this other boy were specifically selected, and their destination was actually Des Moines. So I guess that is possible. Now, what's interesting, something that is interesting, is that he gives some family genealogy about his family that I don't know was totally correct. So that's interesting. But I mean, anytime you're doing some kind of a family history, of course, sometimes the story that's passed down to you as a child is not actually turned out to be correct. So this is a family that were in the Mora Valley and ran sheep quite a ways out, very early on. I think that Juan C. Martinez's father was maybe the first or one of the very first settlers to go into this area. It's the area in Union County. It would be south of Folsom, so Des Moines became the town. But that was when he first came out there, I believe it was in like 1850s. So it was very frontier at that time. It was very dangerous. And I believe they would just go out there to run sheep all the way into like the panhandle of what's now Oklahoma to like Mexhoma, which is sort of on the border there. But then they would maybe return to Mora. They weren't necessarily settling out there, but then at some point, Romualdo Martinez did go out there and settle and start that ranch there that continued for several generations. And the ranch is still there. I still really need to get out there. Apparently there's a Marauda on the property, and the original like ranch house and stuff is still there in a little cemetery. So I do need to get back out there. That's another trip I have planned. It's on, of course, it's owned by a different family now, so I'd have to get permission, but so he gives some information about growing up on the ranch. There is discussion about World War One. It is really interesting, even though they did have money, they did just have a little homestead house that was just like a little one-room house on the ranch, even when he was like the county assessor. And then so that was like in Des Moines, and then he did have to commute to Clayton to do his work as a county assessor. So it says that he would go to work in Clayton all week, and then he would come on the weekends to be with my mother and older brother. And so that's interesting to me because, my family had the ranch that's kind of a haul, even driving it today to get to Clayton. But my great grandfather was the county clerk and did a lot of business in Clayton. And so kind of always wondered, how did that work? And even when he died in the flu epidemic, the papers reported that he contracted the Spanish flu in Clayton, like in town, and then he stayed there for like a night or two, and then he felt better, and then he went back out to the ranch, and then that's when he got sicker and died. So clearly he's like going there. They were commuting and going back and forth quite a bit into Clayton, but that would just be such a huge, especially like in a wagon or an old automobile at the time. I mean, it's literally like a kind of a rough drive now. But that they would maybe have a little house in town that they would stay at during the week, and then would come home on the weekends to be with their families or to tend to the ranch. I mean, there's all kinds of mentions in the newspaper in Clayton about my great-grandfather going out to the ranch to tend to the sheep or being in town. I mean, it's never really been clear to me exactly how that worked. And I did find out that he did buy a lot in Clayton in 1911, which would have been about the time, I believe, that he was the county clerk and had a store. And so did the family come with him? Did he just go by himself and stay there during the week to do his business, and then he went back on the weekends? That's just never really been clear to me. So if anybody knows, feel free to shoot me an email, kind of exactly how that would work. But according to Bill here, his father would stay in Clayton somewhere. Maybe he stayed with my great-grandfather. I don't know, in his little house. I don't know. Maybe he had his own little house. I'm not sure. He talks a little bit about the Dust Bowl, what that was like in the 30s. So that's obviously really interesting. He said his grandfather, so that would have been Juan C. Martinez, had about 2,000 to 3,000 head of sheep out where they were there at Des Moines, or just north of Des Moines. And then he talks about his great-grandfather, so that would be Romualdo Martinez, and his huge ranch. And then they also had a mercantile store in Des Moines as well. So he also talks about the weather, and how the weather had changed. So he said that back when he was a kid, you had to have a sheep-lined jacket all year long. It was very, very cold all year. And his mother, Dolores, used to tell him that when she was a little girl, they would walk right over the boxcars on the railroad tracks because there was just so much snow that you couldn't even tell where the boxcars were. They were just filled in, and you would just walk right over them. And a lot of times they would drive right over the fences because the snow was that high, and they didn't have to open any gates. And then it says they both chuckle. I guess the Bill and the interviewer both had a laugh about that. So they do talk a little bit about the Spanish. So he does say that, his parents, even though they would have, so his parents being Dolores Martinez and Jake Lujan, they spoke Spanish, and that his mother was brought up speaking Spanish, and that she taught school when she was 16 years old out in the country, and she had to walk 3 miles to the school. But that the parents did not speak Spanish at home, and that actually he did learn how to speak Spanish, but it was from the hired help that spoke Spanish. And he says that there were 3 Spaniards from Spain that worked for them on their ranch, and that's where he learned to speak Spanish. So I'm also curious about that, like where there were ranch workers that came from Spain. This would have been like in probably like the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s maybe. So I'm kind of curious about that as well. But he says that that's where he actually learned Spanish, that his parents wouldn't speak it at home even though they were both fluent. So again, they mentioned that they had a house in Clayton so that the kids could go to school there, and then they had the ranch too. So that was something else that was unclear that I've kind of heard a little bit about, is that in the winter or maybe the fall, I don't know, they would move into town, into the town house, so that the kids could go to school. But then I've also heard that they went to school out like at a one-room schoolhouse in the country, and like there would be a wagon that would come and pick up the kids to go to school, or they would like ride in a wagon a mile to school out in the country. So that's a little unclear to me too. It's also, I'm just so fascinated that, you know, you had these families that were sort of wealthy, and then they had these the house in Clayton was maybe 2 rooms, like it was teeny tiny. It's hard for me to imagine the whole family of like 8 kids or whatever moving into town with the parents for the whole winter and everybody living there together. But I guess apparently all the kids would back then would just all sleep together in one room. I don't know. Again, please let me know. Here to learn. So they talk about, I think Mares was one of his family names, and that, so the guy who's interviewing Bill is from Mexico. And so they have a lot of interesting conversations about the differences between Mexico and New Mexico. And he does say that Mares is a very strange name and that you don't hear that in Mexico. And so Bill does say that when he moved to Las Cruces, it was hard for me to be recognized here when I moved here. People didn't want to have much to do with me. They called me Manito. And so the interviewer is asking, what does that word mean? And he says, you know, the Manito from the north. And just because we spoke the Spanish and it was all different than what is down here. And that it's a different culture altogether, Bill says. So they do mention the Basques that were in the area to raise sheep, and I'm wondering if those were some of the Spanish that were working on these ranches as hired hands, but I'm not sure. And he also says that they had a hard time because all the Anglos were very anti-Hispanic, very much anti-Hispanic. They didn't like them at all. And then he says they didn't want any sheep herders around them because they were all Texans that came in and wanted to raise cattle. So they didn't want sheep herders around. So when you had a lot of social problems in that part of the country. So he's talking about northern New Mexico here. So that's kind of interesting. I am really interested in like the transition from sheep raising to cattle raising. And I've heard a couple different theories about that. He describes what it was like when they moved to Santa Fe when his dad was a state comptroller in the 1930s. And his grandfather, so Juan C. Martinez, took care of the ranch while they moved to Santa Fe. And it's interesting here because this is also something I've really wondered about, especially in Union County that's so dry. I mean, I know they had wetter periods for sure. But he makes a distinction between the success that his grandfather had farming versus what his dad had. And it's because the land that his father had, so Jake, Lujan, was dry land farming. And so it was very hard to make a crop. But his grandfather's land, so that's Juan C. Martinez, the ranch that they had running water. There was a big spring. And so he had irrigation that he used to grow alfalfa, and he could grow wheat and vegetables and stuff like that. But their place, even though it was right next to him, was just strictly dryland farming. So it was very hard to make anything go of it. So that's really interesting for some of those homesteaders out there that had success versus those that just couldn't. I mean, if you're trying to do dryland farming out there, that is rough. So that was kind of interesting to me as well. He talks about Santa Fe in the 1930s. Most of the streets were not paved, and there were burros all over the streets, and there were people selling wood on the streets and stuff. He said his dad was the first person to have electricity up in our part of the country, and the first person to have running water in the house, and the first person to have propane. And I think he's talking about Union County at that time, that he was the first one there. He said, an uncle of ours, when the bathrooms started to become inside, he wouldn't go to the bathroom in the house. He said that he couldn't see how you could go outside on the inside because, they called it that they were going outside. And so he wasn't going to go outside on the inside. So he never did put a bathroom in his house. I could kind of see how, if this is something that you always did outside, because obviously there's a smell, it's kind of gross, I could kind of understand a resistance to doing that inside. I mean, it would seem sort of uncivilized. I could definitely see that. So he says they did have a windmill and a drilled well on their property, a drilled well, sorry. And so his dad had a pump on there, so that's how he got electricity. And so they never used lanterns because his dad got electricity right off the bat. And they talk about, did the electricity and the running water go 24 hours a day? Because I think in some parts of the country you only had water from 6 to 9 or electricity for certain times. And they talk about the wooden stove that had the hot water heater attached to it. So that was a really big deal. And then after the heating stoves, they went to kerosene stoves to heat. And the cook stove was the wooden stove that had a tank that you heated the water on. So that was a big deal. And he talks about his dad's first car was a Model T. And when they went on their honeymoon to Cheyenne, Wyoming, they drove the Model T. But Bill says that he never liked cars or pickups or anything because he always had trouble with them and they'd break down and his dad would get mad at him. So he said I'd either walk or go on horseback or on the team horses, that he'd much rather just do that. He's talking about having to crank the Model Ts. He says that they had that ranch, and then his mother and father would go to town about every weekend or every other weekend to get groceries and do business in town. And his dad would give him 10 cents to go to the movies. So I'm guessing that would be either Raton or Clayton. So it's kind of fun to think about. So you get 5 cents to go to the movies and 5 cents to buy popcorn. And his grandmother lived in Clayton, so we'd visit with her there too. The grandmother would be... It wouldn't have been Juanita, it would have been his other grandmother. Talk about going to church. They were very devout Catholics. His grandmother was very devout. She would bring, every night, she'd make the hired men come in from the bunkhouse over to the house and they'd say the rosary. That's intense. So Bill talks about helping his grandfather, Juan C. Martinez, milk the cows. They had 22 head of cows. And he used to like to go visit his grandfather a lot. And so he'd be up at 4 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the evening all the time to milk the cows. And they raised a bunch of orphan lambs. You were just busy all the time. There was just always something to do. So it's kind of also, that's the purpose of these histories, I think, is to talk about farm life and what life used to be like, back in the day. So there's a lot of really cool stuff about that, about, tending to the lambs and stuff like that. Butchering pigs in the winter time. My grandfather, so Juan, used to butcher about 5 hogs there, and my dad too. And then we'd cure the hams and the bacons with Morton salt, and we'd butcher our own beef too. Just hang it out by the side of the building, and it was there all winter because they didn't have freezers at the time. And then he talks about making your own lard from the butchering of the pigs. He talks about a big blizzard in Union County in about 1932. and the postmaster from Des Moines froze to death. And so that's actually how his mother, Dolores, was appointed by President Roosevelt as a postmaster to Des Moines. And so she was the postmistress for 30 some years until she retired. He talks a little bit about radios. In Santa Fe, they had electric radios, but on the ranch, they would use battery radios with great big old batteries. Talks about going to the war and that experience. I mean, it's really interesting too. He talks about sort of, he basically had only known this ranch in Union County, and then he'd gone to Santa Fe when he was a little boy, but really that's all he knew. And then to go to the Pacific during World War II. I mean, I just think that was so life-changing. I mean, it really changed our whole country. So he talks about sort of that experience. And so he says that his, during the Depression, so this is interesting. So he says that so this is the beginning of the Depression, or right when it started. His father, so he was like a politico, and his mother, Dolores, had gone to Washington, D.C. To sell for the President Roosevelt's inauguration. And he was invited to the inauguration, and they were in D.C. when the Depression hit. And they were caught. So they were stuck in D.C. when the Depression came. And he said it was a good thing that his father took a lot of cash with him, because the people that didn't have cash with them, they couldn't get a check cash or do anything. So a lot of people were stuck there, and they said all these people standing out with suits and everything, standing out on the highway trying to hitch a ride home because they couldn't get home because they didn't have any money. And he does say that his dad was invited to 2 inaugurations for President Roosevelt. So Bill was named for Senator Bronson Cutting, a senator in New Mexico. Very close friend of his father's. So clearly his father, Jake, was a mover and shaker. So, going to the war, he said it was really, obviously shocking to go out, because he said he's only been to Santa Fe, and one time he'd gone to Albuquerque, and then once a year they would go to the circus in Trinidad, which I can't even imagine what that circus was like back then. So he said other than that, he was just on the ranch and working all the time. His dad had been in World War I and was a machine gunner. So he kind of did the same thing. But then he was lucky that he had taken typing and shorthand when he was in school, and they needed people to do that. And so he ended up kind of doing like secretarial work. So he thinks that's how he survived the war. He talks about how in the war he started smoking, and which actually I've heard this from a couple of different people. And then he smoked for 55 years, 4 packs a day, and now that he had emphysema. And he said that when he was in the war, that there were a lot of kids that went, and he could hear them crying at night because they'd never been away from home. Because back in those days, people never went any place. And so that was such a huge shock for people, all those men that had to go into the war. It's really hard to think about. He does talk about being in Manila in the Philippines, and that everybody spoke Spanish there, and there were a lot of Spanish people there. And so he would make friends with them, and they would invite him into their home. He really liked it there. He felt like it was a really big adventure. He had a cousin that was in the Death March in Bataan. I meant to look up the details for that, but I don't think I found anything. Okay, so he's talking about Dolores and her adoption from the orphan train. So she says that the young boy that came out with her was 4 years old and she was 3 years old, and they just had a tag on them just like any piece of mail or luggage or whatever it was. And then when they got to their destination, the conductor just took them off the train and turned them over to the people that had adopted them. So it's unclear if this other boy was her brother. It doesn't seem like it was, but he was adopted by her other sister. So I guess I can look into that. I can see, look him up to see what happened with him. So I talk about homesteading. And what's interesting too is that his father, Jake Lujan, first homesteaded in Mexhoma, Oklahoma, which is just over the New Mexico border. And this is interesting because my great-grandfather also first homesteaded over the border in the panhandle of Oklahoma. I actually was just there to try to find it, the property. And so they ended up proving that up and then I guess selling it and then starting the ranch in New Mexico, north of Clayton. So that's interesting. I'm not sure why that was. If it was maybe because, was the land in New Mexico not available at first, and so the land in the panhandle of Oklahoma was very readily available, and so that was where you could get a homestead, and maybe the other, I don't know. I'm not clear about that either. Let me know. He's talking about Des Moines. He says at one time it was a pretty good sized town. I don't know if you've been by there now, but there's not a whole lot there anymore. He said they had 2 banks there, and my grandfather had a big store, a mercantile store, and they had East Des Moines and West Des Moines, they called it. And he was asked what kind of merchandise did your grandfather sell? And he said, everything. Back in those days, everybody had everything. Feed for the animals, just everything, clothing, dry goods. Everything that he sold came on the train from different places. And then they had people that had like salespeople that would go from one place to another selling. So that's where they would get their merchandise, I guess. And then he says again that his parents spoke Spanish, but they didn't speak it to them. So I guess that was just really common for that generation, I guess. He's talking about the Spanish men that came to work on their ranch. That's how he learned Spanish. And so the guy does ask him, did you get any help from across the border in Mexico? And he says, no. Back in those days, we didn't have Mexicans. Now you have a few there, but back in those days, they weren't up that far. So that was in the 20s or the 30s. He says, no, we didn't have that. They were all native people that worked around there. So native people, I think he means like local people. He talks about ranch life, that there was just always something to do. If there was nothing else, you could always cut wood, but that there was always something going on, something to do. He talks about going to St. Michael's School in Santa Fe and that the brothers were really rough. If you didn't do what they wanted, they'd tell you one time, and then if you didn't do what they said, you were in the back of the room, they were liable to throw a piece of chalk and hit you in the head or the eraser or something. He says his dad and his mother went to school with the nuns in Trinidad. In fact, they graduated from the school in Trinidad with the nuns there. Although he said he think they just went to the 8th grade and then they started work. My mother was 16 when she started teaching school. She had a job out away from Des Moines, way out in the country, and she had to live with these people that lived out there, and she used to walk 3 miles to the schoolhouse every day. She was 16 years old. She had to take water and take coal or wood. She used to gather the wood for the fire for the students and everything. He said that there was one doctor in the little town of Des Moines, and he would go to the homes. So he would drive there, and then he said the doctor before him was there when they had that flu epidemic in New Mexico and so many people died. He said that his mother helped the doctor at that time. She was one of the only people that he had to help her. I think that he means that he had help with, because everybody else was sick and a lot of them were dying, and she helped him during that. His name was Dr. Steele. He used to make home trips in his buggy at that time, and they made trips to the houses and took care of people, but there were a lot of people that died from the flu back in that day, including Juan Andreas, my great-grandfather. Would have been one of those people that he was close to, would have been his grandfather's best friend / uncle. So he says that when they closed down the railroad, his dad bought the depot in Des Moines, and he cut it in half and took half of it home and made a barn out of it, and the other half he gave to the church, and they fixed the other half for the church. They took the other church down, and they put this depot church that they had made in another place. And later on, my dad gave them some property closer into the center part of town, and then he and another man built the church that's there now. So that would have been Jake Lujan. He says, again, back to the weather, there was a lot of times that we had snow on the ground. It started snowing in September, and it wouldn't quit until May. We had snow on the ground all the time. And he talks about some of the livestock dying because of that, making it difficult. So it tells a story about a time when there were 3 little kids. They were at home with his mom, and they looked out and they saw the horse that his dad had been riding, but just by himself. So his dad wasn't on the horse. So his mom went out, told them to stay in the house, went out to see if she could go get the horse. It was about a half mile from the house, and she couldn't walk in the snow because it was too deep. So she had to roll all the way till she got to the horse, and then rode it back down to the house. And then by that time, the herder taking care of the sheep had come to try to look for the horse because it had taken off. So he went to go look for Jake, his dad, and some of the sheep, and was found there, and his dad was about to freeze to death. And so he put him back on the horse, and his dad was almost unconscious. And his mom got him in the house, gave him some hot tea and blankets and all that stuff till she brought him back to life. And then that's when she told him about the postmaster freezing to death on that same day. So the postmaster had gotten stuck in the snow and couldn't get out. So he started walking to the little town of Grenville, and, he couldn't see anything. So he froze standing up, walking alongside the fence. And so when my mother told my dad about that, they were really good friends with the postmaster, and my dad went into shock and almost died from the shock. We had a hard time bringing him back. So it wasn't an easy life. So these are some of the stories that you get. And they think that they lost about half the sheep during that blizzard. So he's talking about his mother and her experience with the Martinezes, her adoptive parents, that they had her working just like any other kid. So when she was 5 years old, she had to go on the buggy into town to get coal for her father and everything. They would send her by herself, 5 years old, with a buggy. And, he'd get her father would get it ready, and she'd go into town about 8 miles from the ranch at 5 years old. And it says that my grandmother made her take, they adopted her because my grandmother couldn't have any kids. But then she did. So that's also was the story of my family as well. My brother and sister were adopted because my parents couldn't have kids. And then 10 years later, suddenly they could. He talks about how people in that area back at that time used to help each other when they were harvesting the wheat or harvesting beans and stuff like that. People would help each other out. There was not that much farming up in the country in Union County. I think because it was dry land. So typically they were branding cattle or weaning the cattle, moving cattle together with their neighbors. He tells a story about an old uncle of my mother's. So it would have been Dolores' uncle. So I kind of maybe need to figure out who that would have been. It could have been could have been Juan Andreas, I guess. And a cousin of my dad's wanted to make a trip to Mexico. So they were going to take 2 cars and ask if I would drive one of the cars. So we made this trip to Mexico and stayed 6 weeks in Mexico and took 2 cars with 2 families. So that's really interesting. You know, when I interviewed someone, her father went to Mexico. The whole family moved to Mexico because they needed ranch workers who were experienced to treat hoof and mouth disease for the cattle down there, I think. So I'm wondering if this was something, he doesn't seem to know why they went down there exactly. He doesn't seem to really have an explanation for that, but I'm wondering if that's why they went down there. But anyways, when they came back up and stopped in La Union, I'm not sure where that is. Brief interruption from the future. La Union is outside of El Paso in Doña Ana County. Because Bill's sister-in-law went to college with this cousin of mine from Roy, New Mexico. And that's where he met his wife. So I think his wife was from Mexico. I think La Union is in Mexico. So it's interesting because he's like giving some of his own ancestry and his wife's ancestry. And he talks about how his wife's ancestry were Moorish from Spain. They were not Mexicanos or anything. Their ancestors were Moorish people. They weren't out of Mexico. Well, and then the interviewer says, well, they had to come from Mexico if they came because that was the only way here. And then he says, well, they didn't ever live in Mexico. Their ancestors lived in Mexico. And so anyways, I think this is kind of interesting to hear him working that out and maybe not knowing about his own ancestry. He goes into a little bit about after he got out of the service and had lived around, he decided to go back to Des Moines in Union County to run like a mercantile store and do the ranch and stuff like that. And it just didn't work out. He said, you know, you go back home and it's just not the same, especially if you've been gone. People think of you as an outsider. And he also said that like I think the by that point the sort of dynamic about small towns had changed quite a bit. Like people would like not buy their stuff at the local town stores. They would go somewhere else, like to the bigger towns maybe. And just that it had become really, really hard to make a go with ranching. So it's kind of interesting to hear just sort of over his life, he's talking about the economic changes that have happened, you know, basically in rural New Mexico and rural areas and probably in a lot of states, that, you know, he's talking, especially it's interesting because he's giving this for the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum and talking about basically how that experience has changed. So, you know, there was the experience of his grandparents, his parents, and now his own experience when he tried to do it was very different because the things had changed so much. So that's kind of interesting. And, you know, just that basically it was just really hard to make a go of it. Even he says that his mom had to work all the time because they had to spend all their money, you know, on the ranch, you know, maintaining the ranch, keeping it up. And then that he did spend a lot of money helping other people. So on the church, helping other people. He wanted to see the area get ahead. So he did a lot for the people in the community. But also in the background, he recognizes that his mother had to keep working to actually like keep food on the table. And then he says, if you don't live on the ranch and keep it up all the time, it just deteriorates. You have to constantly be working on them. He does mention the Cornet Ranch, that Carlos Cornet was his, like a brother to him. And that he still had a ranch out there. And the Cornet Ranch is still, I can confirm, still going in that area outside of Folsom. He talks about, it looks like his wife, maybe his wife was from down, I mean, it must have been like either in Mexico or pretty far south, southern New Mexico. And so he talks about her experiences with prisoners of war working on the farms out there to pick cotton. There are about 400 of them, German prisoners of war that they brought from South Africa to work down there. And there were also Italian prisoners of war. They were behind the fence and they would all wave at her when she walked by to school. And then the Japanese that were interned were out that way too. In different camps. Wow, we're just really just love doing that to people. So this is really precious. So these are people like Juan and Juanita Martinez are people that I had been researching for years. For years, I had all this information about them. And then from this oral history, I get an actual like little snippet of who they actually were and what they were actually like. So this is a story that he tells where he'd go with his grandfather, so that'd be Juan. He'd go with his grandfather to town to sell milk and cream and stuff like that and buy things they needed for the ranch. And then the grandfather would always go to the bar. So he'd give me a nickel or a dime to go buy me some candy or something, and he'd go to the bar and he'd get drunk sometimes. And he wanted me to go with him so that I could drive home. Then we'd get home and he'd tell me to drive straight to the barn. So I'd drive the horses straight to the barn. He'd get off the wagon and then he'd go hide his bottle that he had bought, like in the rocks in the barn. And then we'd drive up to the house to unload the groceries and stuff up there. And my grandmother would meet him at the door and she said, "Juan, I've got something in my eye. See if you can blow it out." So what she wanted was him to blow on her eye and she'd smell if he'd been drinking. So this is so priceless, that, these people were just sort of like names in papers and stuff for so long. And then to hear a hilarious story like that about just like this married couple that had been together for a long time. And, obviously the wife knows what's going on and knows how to deal with her husband. So priceless to get this little snippet of them. So he says that when they sold the milk and the cream, it went from Des Moines. They put it on a train and then it would go to Trinidad. And then they would make butter and cheese with it in Trinidad. And then they would get the containers back. And they had they still have some of the containers and he had given it to some of his kids. And so they would send it on the train with the milk and the cream in it. And then they'd put it back on the train, on the following train. And then they would go collect the empty containers. And I guess some of those containers were on exhibit at the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum as well at some point. And so the interviewer asks him if he ever sold the cream or milk to people in town. He said no, very seldom, because practically everybody had their own cow in town. So they always had their own milk and their cream, so they didn't need to buy it in town. So that was kind of interesting to think about. And then you could make butter at home. But they also then they have eggs. They could trade what they got off the ranch, wherever they owed money or whatever, they were going to buy other groceries. They'd give them eggs or cream or butter or something to pay for the groceries they were going to get. They also would use that to pay for the telephone bill. And he said by the telephone bill, I mean the telephone at that time was just on the barbed wire fence. They didn't have any poles to take the telephone wire, so you just hooked the line to the barbed wire fence that you had for the animals. And then if the animals ran through the fence and broke the fence down, then you had to walk the whole fence to find out where the wire was broken so you could put it back together. So he said later on, his dad got all these people together, and they set up a telephone distribution company, and they put in telephone poles all over, and he was head of that. And I actually do have a picture by City of Dust of a very old telephone wire in Union County. So I'll have to post that on the YouTube version of this episode. He also says the rural electrification, where they put electricity all over, he also was ahead of that. So he said his dad was always doing some community project, helping other people. That was his big thing. He said that his dad, so this is Jake Lujan, started the American Legion Post in Clayton. And they used to put on big parties and rodeos. And my mother and dad, they loved to do plays. They'd dress up with all the people and have different plays. And he said that he enjoyed doing that. And before he got married, he did it in Des Moines too. So that's kind of amazing to think about. He says people would come to it because there was nothing else to do. Sometimes he used to drive 100 miles just to go to a dance. Okay, so that's what I was talking about earlier, where it's like weird to think about people coming from Trinchera down to Folsom for a party, but that's what you would do. So he said somebody on some other ranch, or that worked on the ranches, would have dances on the weekend, and he remembers going to visit people like that, and they would dance on the dirt floors, and they would have guitars and violin, and they'd sing in Spanish and English, and they would dance corridos. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm sure someone will tell me. It says they were Spanish, but they weren't under the Mexican influence. They had their own type of music, you might say. You know, just like they have their own language. So he's talking about the Manitos again. He says that's why they called him that, because it's like it was a very different, distinctive culture. And he says that when they would drive 100 miles just to go visit somebody or go to a dance, they would spend the night with them and then come home the next day. So that's kind of something else that I wondered about. Like, if you drove all that way, you didn't go straight back over, you would stay there overnight. So he talks about Las Cruces different than like Santa Fe. And he says he prefers Las Cruces because there's just too much politics. And he doesn't like politics because when he was young and when his dad was in politics, he could see all the backstabbing that was going on. That he knew all the back and forth behind the scenes stuff. So something really fascinating that I also found in this oral history is, so Bill's talking about going to war and what a different experience of what that was for him, and how wild it was after really not really leaving northern New Mexico for his entire life to then suddenly be not just in a different part of the world, but also when you're in the service, there's so many different other types of people in the service with you. And so he talks about, his parents never really talked about anybody at home. So he really didn't know, when people talked about Jews, he would say like, what's Jew? What does that mean? The people would talk about Polacks. He said, what's a Polak? I don't know what that means. And then they were talking about the other, like the black companies. And that the other people, they would use like the N-word, and he didn't really understand what it meant. And then he says that he'd never been around blacks because in Clayton, there was a law that only one black family could live there at one time. And so there was only one black man in Clayton at that time. So this would have been like the 1920s, I think. His name was Bill. They had like a derogatory term for him. And then he says his mother would get so upset because when his brother was a baby and they'd be out on the streets with her friends and stuff, his baby brother would always want, when they would see Bill, he would sort of reach out his arms like he wanted Bill to pick him up, and she would let him. And so Bill would like hold the African American Bill who was this is allegedly the only black man in Clayton, would hold her baby, and they would chat or whatever. And the other women that she were with were just like really appalled that she would let him hold her baby and would be talking with him and stuff like that. And his mother just thought that was ridiculous. So he just didn't know anything about, what the difference was. They just had never really he'd never heard anything bad or different about people that were different than him. And so he just had like never really been exposed to that. So then when he got into the service, suddenly there were all these differences, and it just didn't, he hadn't been taught that at it from a young age. So he didn't, it's like that kind of thing has to be taught. So that was just really interesting to hear that. And so I actually did reach out to our Hertzstein Museum in Clayton to see if they had heard about was this like an official law? Was this one of those sort of unwritten things that was just sort of known? Like, was Clayton a sundown town? Sometimes if it wasn't like a municipal policy or law, it would be written into like a neighborhood association covenant, or like a subdivision, or whoever the development was in that area might have that written into the covenant for that, anybody who was going to live in that development or whatever. So I have a friend who works she's a landman for an oil and gas company, and she says that she still runs into that sometimes because they've just like copied and pasted the language from like a deed or whatever, and didn't really pay attention to it. And so literally sometimes the title or the deed or whatever to this land still says like this can only go to white people. So the Hertzstein Museum was not able to find anything. They checked a couple of different sources and asked around. I did actually interview Bess Isaacs, who was the sort of town matriarch in Clayton for many years. Unfortunately, she did just pass away, I think, last year. I did actually interview her one time. Her family owned Isaacs Hardware I was like the longest running business. Definitely in Clayton, I'm not sure, maybe even in New Mexico. Unfortunately, it also just closed down after she passed. But she did tell me that the Isaacs family had, a ranch outside of town, and that the KKK would come like in the middle of the night, like threatening them. And either she or her mother-in-law would just like come out in her nightgown with a shotgun and just like shoot at them. And they would just like scurry away or whatever. But that was because they were Jewish. So I don't know what the presence of if there was a KKK presence, that would enforce this sort of law or something like that. There was a resurgence of white supremacy and the KKK in the 1920s across the country. So that would have been about the time period where there maybe would have been a policy like that. But I did also reach out to the African American Museum and Cultural Center of New Mexico and didn't hear back. So if anybody knows, or just wants to, if you want to come in and do an episode where we just talk about that, I would be fascinated to hear about that. But just really interesting. I have so much family history in Clayton, and I was just blown away to hear something like that. Not that, I shouldn't be blown away. Stuff like that. The town I live in now was a sundown town, and the local museum just recently had an exhibit about it, and just sort of the insidious nature of those types of policies that were either written or unwritten, either obvious or just sort of known. Like if you were a person of color, you just had to know about that, or suffer consequences if you happen to be traveling through. So just really interesting. There's so many tidbits in this oral history. I really highly recommend checking out the oral histories that they have available there. I'm not sure if if you're not in Las Cruces and can't make a visit in person, they might be able to make a copy of it and send it to you for maybe a donation or something. I'm not sure. And then also just sort of just looking into, just a basic Google can sometimes turn up things that you don't expect. And also just sort of looking at some of those peripheral figures in your tree. Maybe they're not like a direct ancestor or directly connected, but maybe they were, really close to your family, and there could be information out there that's useful either directly about your family or even just something to give you that context. Like, it was just really great context for me to hear that, Juan C. Martinez's grandfather was a freighter on the Santa Fe Trail, and that's how, they kind of came to settle in that area that was pretty far afield, that then became like a really big part of my family history. So that was really great context. And then, of course, just to hear what their lives were like, which is the part that I'm always so interested in, to hear, that they had to wear, wool-lined jackets all year round. As someone who spent a lot of time in that area, that's really hard to imagine. And just also reflecting on how much New Mexico's changed, our country's changed, just our economy and the way that we live. Just really fascinating to hear how they lived. So this was a really long one, but making up for lost time. And should be back soon with some really great interviews. So we'll be in touch soon. Thanks for listening to Luminaria. You can reach me at luminariapod@gmail.com. Our intro and outro music is of Varsoviana, performed by Nieves Anaya and his daughter Ernestina Anaya at Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico in 1940. It's part of the Juan Bautista Rael collection at the Library of Congress.